The night it happened, nobody in Seoul could believe what they were seeing. Not the district elders who had watched this city change for 40 years. Not the merchants who had seen everything from gang wars to government raids. Not even the men who had served Kang Jiwoo for a decade and thought they knew every version of him that existed. They were all standing in that square. All of them. And every single one of them went completely, absolutely still. Because Kang Jiwoo, the most feared man in South Korea, was on his knees. Not wounded, not defeated, not forced down by anyone or anything. Kneeling. By his own choice. In front of hundreds of witnesses. In broad daylight. This was the man who had a senator removed from his position with one phone call. The man whose name made police inspectors clear their throats and look away. The man who had built an empire from grief, from blood, from 17 years of never once showing the world anything soft inside him. And he was on his knees. Now, before you find out how we got here, I need you to understand something. Because this is not just a love story. This is a story about what happens when the most armored person in the world meets someone so genuinely, unapologetically good, that all that armor starts to feel like a prison. This is the story of Kang Jiwoo, and the woman who made a whole city bow without ever asking it to. Welcome to Seoul of Africa, where African hearts and Korean souls meet in the most emotional love stories ever told. Subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications, because you will not see the ending coming. Kang Jiwoo, 34 years old, head of the Kdrama, the Black Dragon organization, the most powerful and most feared criminal syndicate in South Korea. To the outside world, he was the chairman of 3 legitimate businesses, a luxury hotel chain that stretched across 6 cities, a private security firm contracted by some of the country's largest corporations, and a construction empire responsible for half the new developments in Seoul's wealthiest districts. But behind all of it, in the language spoken in back rooms, in the silence that fell when his car pulled up to a building, Jiwoo was the king. 6'2", always in black, a silver watch on his left wrist that cost more than most families earned in 3 years. Eyes the color of winter, not cold in a dramatic way, cold in the way of a man who had looked at enough darkness that warmth had simply stopped registering. He moved through rooms the way a storm moves through open country, slowly, without hurry, and everything in his path adjusted. His men did not just fear him. They worshipped him. Because Jiwoo was the kind of leader who never asked his people to do what he had not already done himself. He was the first to arrive, the last to leave. And in 12 years of running the Kdrama, he had never once broken his own code. One rule, just one. And every person who had ever spent more than 5 minutes in his presence knew it by heart. I do not repeat myself. I do not apologize. And I never, ever bow. It was a Thursday afternoon when Park Sung-ho made the mistake of testing him. Sung-ho was a district boss, small territory, big ego, and a recent habit of allowing his men to operate inside Jiwoo's zone in Mappo without permission. He had been summoned. He arrived in an expensive suit that he was already sweating through. 2 bodyguards flanked him, both of them visibly praying they would not need to do anything today. Jiwoo sat at the head of the table. He was reading a document. He did not look up. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. The bodyguards shifted. Sung-ho's breathing got louder. The room had the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made you feel like the walls were slowly closing in. Finally, Sung-ho broke. "Jiwoo-si," he said, voice cracking at the edges. "I know there was a misunderstanding about the Mappo territory." "Misunderstanding," Jiwoo said, still not looking up, just repeating the word back, flat as a blade laid on a table. "I swear on my children, I didn't know my men were operating in your zone." Now Jiwoo looked up, slowly, the way a glacier moves, inevitable, massive, impossible to stop. "Your children," he said. A pause. Interesting word choice. Sung-ho's face went the color of old paper. And then, in front of his own bodyguards, in front of Jiwoo's assembled lieutenants, Park Sung-ho got on his knees. A grown man, a district boss, on the floor. Voice breaking completely. "Please, I'll return everything. Double. I'll give you double." Jiwoo watched him, not with satisfaction, not with cruelty, with nothing. The same expression a man wears when he watches rain fall, noticing it, but entirely unmoved by it. He took one slow sip of water, set the glass down with a quiet click, stood, straightened his jacket. "Get him out," he said. permanently. Then he walked to the window and looked at the city below, like a man who had just swatted a fly and was already thinking about something else entirely. That was who Kang Jiwoo was. That was the version of himself he had spent 17 years building. And to understand why it eventually crumbled, you need to understand what built it. When Jiwoo was 17 years old, his father was killed. Not in a gang war, not in a dramatic standoff. His father was a small-time businessman who ran a printing shop in Mapo district. A local gang came to collect protection money. His father, an honest, stubborn, deeply principled man, looked them in the eye and said no. They killed him on the street outside their house, on a Tuesday evening. At 6 o'clock, when the light was still golden and the neighbors were coming home from work, and Jiwoo watched it happen. From the gate, 17 years old, unable to move, unable to stop it, unable to do anything except stand there while the most important person in his world was taken from him in under 3 minutes. He buried his father. He looked at his mother's broken face. And that same night, sitting in the dark of his father's printing shop, he made a decision that rewired everything inside him. He would never be powerless again. He would build something so strong, so feared, so untouchable that no one would ever be able to take anyone from him again. And he would never show softness. Because softness, he had decided, was what got people killed. 17 years later, he had kept every part of that promise. Every part, except the one he had not yet met. Seo Minjung, 30 years old, community doctor. She ran a free clinic in Mapo district, the same neighborhood that Jiwoo's syndicate controlled, the same streets where his men collected debts, the same corners where his world pressed down hardest on the people who had the least. She was not what anyone expected when they heard the word respected. She was not loud, she was not connected. She had no money behind her name, no powerful family, no title that opened doors. What she had was something quieter than all of those things and far more rare. She had presence. The kind that made people feel, when she looked at them, that they were the most important person in the room. The kind you cannot manufacture and cannot buy. The kind that is built slowly and invisibly by years of simply showing up for people who had stopped expecting anyone to show up for them. The street vendors in Mapo brought her food. Not because she asked, but because she had once stayed through an entire night with a vendor's 8-year-old son during a fever that refused to break. The gang members in the district came to her clinic with wounds they could not explain to a hospital, and she treated them without a single question and without a single flicker of judgment. The elderly grandmothers on her street saved her a seat at every community gathering. The children ran to her by name. She had not set out to be loved by a district. She had just kept coming back, day after day, for 7 years, and the city had decided, without being asked, that she belonged to it. Now, let me show you how she operated, because you cannot understand what Jiwoo eventually felt until you watch her in action. It was a Wednesday morning. The clinic was full. It was always full. Minjung was stitching a cut on a teenage boy's forearm, her hand steady and precise, when the door banged open hard enough to rattle the frame. 3 men walked in, designer suits, heavy gold chains. The particular kind of walk that announced, before a single word was spoken, that these men believed the air in any room automatically belonged to them. At the front was Lee Chang-soo, a loan shark with connections to one of the district's smaller gangs. He had the smile of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. He spread his arms wide. Dr. Nim, always working so hard. We should talk. This building, we've purchased the land. You have 30 days to find a new location. Minjung did not look up. Hand me the gauze, please, she said to her nurse. Chang-soo blinked. Did you hear me? 30 days. She finished the stitch. Looked at the boy. All done. Come back Thursday for the dressing. Then, and only then, she looked at Chang-soo. Fully, directly, without a single trace of the anxiety he was accustomed to producing in people. I heard you, she said. I have been in this building for 7 years. The people on this street have been here their whole lives. You have until tomorrow morning to find somewhere else to put your investment. Chang-soo laughed. It was the laugh of a man who found the situation genuinely amusing. He stepped forward, closing the distance, using his size, the oldest intimidation tactic in the world. And if we don't? He said. Minjung stood up from her stool. She was half his width. She looked at him without blinking. Then you explain to 400 people on this street, she said quietly, why you closed their only doctor. That conversation will not go the way you're planning. He laughed again. Left. His men filed out behind him, still smiling. The next morning, Minjung opened the clinic door and stopped. The entire street was standing outside. Nobody had organized it. Nobody had sent a message. They had simply woken up, heard what had happened, and come. Old grandmothers in house slippers, young men with their arms crossed, market vendors who had left their stalls, mothers with children on their hips, all of them, quiet, solid, immovable. Lee Chang-soo arrived an hour later, saw the crowd, looked at the clinic, looked at the crowd again, turned his car around and drove away. Minjung stood in her doorway for a long moment. And then she said, barely above a whisper to no one in particular, "Thank you." Ryun had been in that crowd, not visibly and from a parked car at a distance. He went back to headquarters and told Jiwoo everything. He described the crowd, described Chang-soo leaving, described the doctor standing in the doorway. Jiwoo sat very still through all of it, said nothing. Then, after a long pause, he asked one question. Only one. "What's her name?" Ryan told him. And Jiwoo wrote nothing down, because he had already memorized it. The first time they met in person, there was no romance in it. None. It felt like two weather systems colliding. Two completely different forces of nature in the same small room, both entirely unprepared for the other. It was a rainy Friday afternoon. Jiwoo's younger sister, Jia, 24 years old, the one person on earth that Jiwoo loved without condition or calculation, had collapsed on a street 2 blocks from the clinic. Panic attack. Her bodyguards had been caught in traffic. She was on the pavement in the rain when Minjung, walking back from a pharmacy run, found her. By the time Jiwoo arrived, 6 black cars, 8 bodyguards, the kind of arrival that made pedestrians stop walking and stare. Jia was sitting up in the clinic, wrapped in a blanket, laughing at something Minjung had said. Her color was back. Her breathing was even. She looked somehow more relaxed than Jiwoo had seen her in months. He walked in. The room froze. His bodyguards, his driver, the nurse at the reception desk, everyone became very still and very quiet. Everyone except the woman standing at the desk with her back to him, writing in a medical file. She didn't turn around. His bodyguard cleared his throat. She still didn't turn around. Jiwoo walked to the desk himself, stopped 2 feet behind her. "My sister," he said. "How is she?" Minjung finished writing the sentence she was on, set down her pen, then turned, not startled, not in a hurry, and looked at him. "She's fine," she said. "Panic attack, not cardiac. She needs rest, significantly less stress, and someone in her life who actually speaks to her instead of just placing bodyguards around her." Then she picked up her pen and went back to writing. Dead silence. Jiwoo's bodyguard, Sergeant Oh, looked at Ryun. Ryun looked at the ceiling. Because nobody had ever spoken to Kang Jiwoo like that. Nobody had ever turned away from him mid-sentence. Nobody had ever delivered a quiet criticism of his behavior and then simply returned to their paperwork. He stood there, and the strangest thing happened inside him, the thing he would spend the next 3 months refusing to examine. He was not angry. He was something else, something that had no name in the vocabulary he had built for himself. After a moment, he straightened up. "How much do I owe you?" "It's a free clinic," she said without looking up. "The word free means the amount is 0. Your sister can leave when she's ready. Please don't bring those cars again. They block the ambulance lane." And she walked to the next patient. Jiwoo left, got in his car, and sat in the back seat in complete silence while his driver waited for an instruction that didn't come for 11 full minutes. That night he called Ryun and said, "I want everything. Her full file, her background, how the clinic is funded, everything." Ryun asked, "Is she a threat?" Jiwoo was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Just get it." He read her file alone at 2 in the morning, in his penthouse, with a glass of whiskey he poured and never touched. He read about her mother, the diagnosis, the treatment that was never consistent because of money, the death at 51 years old from something that should have been manageable. He read about Minjung working 3 jobs through medical school, the honors degree, the 3 hospital offers she turned down, the clinic she opened on the same street where her mother used to buy vegetables, funded from her own savings and whatever she could raise from the community. He closed the file. He sat in his very expensive penthouse, in the city his empire helped shape, and felt something he had not felt since he was 17 years old, standing at that gate, guilty. Because his world, the world he had built, was one of the reasons people in that district couldn't afford medicine. One of the reasons women like Min-jung's mother died from things that shouldn't have been fatal. His organization collected from those streets. His men operated in those shadows. And all the while, one woman had been in the middle of it, quietly trying to repair what his world helped break. He picked up his phone, called his financial manager, said, "Anonymous transfer, 6 months of operating costs for the free clinic in Mapo. I want it untraceable. Do it tonight." He hung up, looked at the city outside his window, and did not sleep. She said nothing, but she knew. Then the real attack came. Chairman Beck was a property developer. Publicly, he was a respected businessman with government connections. Privately, he was bankrolled by the Cheongpa organization, Jiwoo's most powerful rival, and his current assignment was to fracture Jiwoo's hold on Mapo district by destabilizing everything Jiwoo's presence was built on. He started with legal notices. Every building on 3 streets received formal acquisition paperwork. The clinic received its notice on a Tuesday morning. Then came the slower pressure, building inspectors arriving unannounced, citing violations that didn't exist, contractors showing up to assess buildings that weren't for sale. Then, one Thursday night, the clinic windows were smashed. All of them. Clean through. Glass across the floor, the examination table, the children's waiting corner with the small plastic chairs. Min-jung filed a police report. The officer who took it looked uncomfortable the entire time and never made eye contact. Nothing happened. She arrived the next morning at 6 o'clock, stood in the doorway and looked at the broken glass catching the early light. Then she went inside, got the broom from the supply closet, and started sweeping. Her first patient arrived at 7. She treated them. Second patient at 7:15. She treated them too. All day. Clinic open, hands steady, voice calm. In a building with no windows in November with the cold coming through every gap. Word reached Jiwoo by 9 that morning. He put down his coffee cup. He stood up. "Get the car," he said. Ryun reached for his radio to call the security detail. "Alone," Jiwoo said. Ryun stopped. "Boss, if the Cheongpa have eyes on the district and they see you there without—" "Good," Jiwoo said. He was already walking out. "Let them see." He showed up at the clinic at 10 o'clock. No cars, no men. Just Jiwoo in his black coat, standing in the empty window frame where the glass used to be. Min-jung was with a patient. She finished, walked to him, crossed her arms. "You heard," she said. "This won't happen again," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The way she looked at everything, fully, directly, without flinching. "Are you protecting my clinic?" she asked. "Or protecting your territory?" Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. That means something is happening underneath it. And then Kang Jiwoo, who had never given an honest answer to a personal question in 17 years, said quietly, "Both." He held her gaze for 1 second longer, then turned and left before she could respond. Min-jung stood at the empty window frame and watched his car pull away. Her nurse Yoonji appeared at her shoulder. "Was that—" Yoonji started. "Close your mouth," Min-jung said. "We have patience." But her hands, as she turned back to the examination room, were not quite steady. Over the next 3 weeks, Jiwoo kept coming back. He told himself each time that it was strategic. Territory monitoring, intelligence gathering, entirely professional. His men did not believe this. His men had started quietly and collectively, visiting a temple to light incense in thanks that their boss had apparently, against all odds, discovered he was a human being. He sent food to the clinic, for the staff, he said. Min-jung distributed it without thanking him. He stayed longer than necessary, leaning against his car across the street, watching the lit windows. He told himself he was watching for Cheongpa activity. Then one evening he overheard her through the open door, on the phone with a funding organization, her voice doing a thing he had never heard it do before. Strained, almost cracking, trying to hold together the ask for money she needed to keep the lights on. He stood outside and listened, said nothing, left. By the next morning, a second anonymous donation had arrived. Operational costs covered for another 4 months. She opened the email, read it, sat very still. Then for just a moment, just one moment when she thought nobody was watching, she put her face in her hands. Not from sadness, from the feeling of being held quietly and invisibly by someone who refused to let her see it was them. But the Tuesday night, the night that undid everything for Jiwoo, arrived 3 weeks later. It was 10:30. Min-jung was alone in the clinic treating a 6-year-old with a fever that had been climbing all evening. The parents were beside themselves, a young couple, exhausted, terrified in the way that only the parents of sick children understand, their faces doing everything their voices were too frightened to say. Jiwoo's car was parked across the street. It had been there for 2 hours. He sat in the back seat in the dark and told himself one more time that he was monitoring the Cheongpa threat in the area. At 11 o'clock, the child's fever broke. The parents burst, completely, messily, beautifully, into tears. They thanked Minjung in the flooding, stumbling way of people whose relief is bigger than language. She walked them out, watched them go, stood on the clinic steps as their footsteps faded down the street. Then she sat down on the cold concrete and exhaled, the long, private exhale of someone who has been holding everything together all day and has finally, in the dark and the quiet, allowed themselves to be tired. After a moment, she looked across the street, directly at his car. She had known it was there. She had probably known for a while. She said nothing. She just looked. Jiwoo got out of the car. He crossed the street, and he sat down on the steps beside her. Not close, not far, just beside her. Neither of them spoke. A minute passed, then another. Then she said, looking at the sky rather than at him, "You don't have to keep coming here." A pause. "I know," he said. He didn't move. Another silence, longer this time. The kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that is very, very full. "What do you want, Jiwoo?" she asked. And Kang Jiwoo, who had commanded boardrooms and ended careers without blinking, who had answers for everything and apologies for nothing, had nothing, because what he wanted could not be taken, could not be bought, could not be intimidated into existence. What he wanted was something so far outside his understanding of how the world worked that he didn't even have a shape for it yet. He sat on those cold steps and said nothing. And that silence, that particular helpless, undone silence, was the moment. The exact moment. That was when Kang Jiwoo lost, fully and without recovery, and simply didn't have the language to admit it yet. Ryun cleared his throat. "Boss," he said, "the men asked me to bring something to your attention." "Speak," Jiwoo said without looking up. "You have driven through Mapo District 11 times this week. You have made 2 anonymous donations to a medical clinic. You sat on concrete stairs at 11 o'clock at night in November." A pause. "And yesterday in this office you were humming." Jiwoo looked up slowly. "I was not humming." "Boss," Ryun said, with the gentleness of a man who loves his employer and values his own life equally. "You were humming." The silence that followed was very long. "Get out," Jiwoo said. "The men lit incense at the temple," Ryun said, backing toward the door. "Genuinely. They're very happy for you." "Ryun, leaving, boss." The door closed. Jiwoo sat alone. He looked at his reflection in the polished surface of his desk. For a long moment, he studied the face looking back at him, looking for the cold man, the controlled man, the man who had not felt anything unnecessary in 17 years. He found instead a man who had apparently been humming. Then the Cheongpa made their most dangerous move. They spread a rumor, clean, surgical, and perfectly aimed. Seo Minjung was a police informant. She had been feeding information about the Hukryong organization, about its operations, its people, its leadership, directly to a special investigations unit. For months, possibly years, she had used her clinic and her access to the district as cover. The rumors spread through Mapo in less than 12 hours. In tight communities, a story like that moves the way fire moves through dry wood, not in a line, but in every direction at once. By the next morning, the clinic was empty. Patients who had come every week for years did not come. People who had stood in the street to protect her crossed to the other side now when they saw her. A group of men she didn't recognize spray-painted the word traitor across the clinic's front wall in red letters 2 feet high. Minjung arrived at 6 in the morning and stood in front of that wall. She read the word, and she went inside, opened the clinic, sat at her desk, and waited all day. Not one patient. Jiwoo came that evening. He walked in and found her at her desk, not crying. Minjung did not cry in front of people. He had come to understand that about her. But her face had a quality he had never seen on it before. The quality of someone who has spent everything they had and are sitting in the aftermath of the spending. She looked up. Their eyes met. And something in Jiwoo's chest, the thing that had been building and building for months, the thing he had been refusing to name, pressing down, locking away, broke completely open. He turned around. He called an emergency meeting of his entire inner council that same night. 12 men, the people who ran his world. He told them what he was going to do the next morning. The room went very still. His oldest advisor, Choi, spoke first. "Jiwoo," he said, "if you do this publicly, you show every enemy you have that this woman is the way to reach you. You put a target on her that will never come off." "They already found her," Jiwoo said. "She already has the target. I didn't put it there. My world did." "Your reputation." Choi. Jiwoo's voice dropped to the register it reached when the conversation was over. "What is a reputation worth if the one person who deserves to stand in safety cannot stand in safety because of the world I built? I made this empire so I would never be powerless again." He paused. "If I cannot use it for this, then tell me, what was it ever for?" Nobody spoke. Then, from the back of the room, Ryun said quietly, "I'll call the district heads." The next day, Noon, Mapo District Square. The word had moved fast, the way word always moved in this district, through doors and windows and the spaces between people who had known each other their whole lives. The district heads were there. Business owners, community elders, gang-affiliated men who had not been told to come but came anyway because they understood, instinctively, that something was being decided today that they needed to witness. Minjung received a message from Ryun at 11:45. "Medical emergency at the square. Come immediately." She arrived with her bag, moving fast, pushing through the edge of the crowd. She stopped. There was no emergency. There was just Jiwoo, standing in the center of the square, alone. No bodyguards, no cars, no entourage. Just him, in his black coat, standing in the cold noon light. He turned, found her face in the crowd immediately, like he had known exactly where she would emerge. He walked toward her. The crowd parted without being asked. Silence gathered itself and settled over the square like a held breath. He stopped in front of her. She looked at him, searching his face, trying to read what was happening. Her voice was low enough that only he could hear. "What are you doing?" He did not answer. Instead, slowly, deliberately, in front of every set of eyes in that square, Kang Jiwoo went down on one knee. The silence became total. He raised his voice. Clear, unwavering, every word landing like it had been chosen carefully and would not be taken back. "This woman has spent 7 years healing this district. She has treated your children and your parents and your brothers. She has never once asked for payment. She has never once asked for protection. She has never asked for anything from any of us, and we repaid her with a lie." He paused. "She is not an informant. She is not an enemy of this organization or this community. She is the reason half the people standing in this square right now are still alive to stand here." Another pause, longer this time. "Let it sit. Anyone who repeats that rumor, anyone who disrespects her, follows her, threatens her, or causes her one moment of harm, answers to me. Personally, you all know what that means. You all know I do not say things twice." He stayed on one knee. In the silence, one elder bowed his head. Then another, a merchant. Then, slowly, one by one, even the hardened gang-affiliated men in the crowd dipped their chins. The rumor did not die slowly. It died in that square, in that minute, all at once, like a fire running out of air. Minjung looked down at him. Her jaw was set. Her shoulders were straight. But her eyes were full in a way she could not entirely control. She said in a voice that was steady because she was making it be steady, "Get up, Jiwoo." He rose, stood in front of her, eye to eye. She looked at him for a long moment, and then quietly, so quietly that the people nearest them had to lean in to hear, she said, "You didn't have to do that." And Kang Jiwoo, who had not smiled genuinely in longer than he could remember, looked at her and said, "Yes, I did." And then he smiled, small, quiet, the kind of smile that surfaces when something has been underwater for too long and finally reaches the air. The whole square saw it, and nobody forgot it. Now, this is the part where some stories give you the easy ending, the clean one, the one where everything resolves and the credits roll and you walk away satisfied. This is not that story. Because Jiwoo's world did not stop being dangerous the day he knelt in that square. His enemies were watching. The Cheongpa had seen everything. And choosing to love someone openly, in a world built on leverage and vulnerability, meant that she would always be the thing someone could try to use against him. There were nights that were hard. There were conversations between them that had no easy answers. There were things he had done that she had to decide for herself whether she could sit beside. But here is what I will tell you. The clinic never had a funding problem again. Mapo District became the most protected neighborhood in Seoul, not because of intimidation, but because something in the community had shifted. Because they had watched their king kneel for someone who had been kneeling for them for 7 years. And that changed something in people that rules and fear never could. And Kang Jiwoo, the man who had spoken only in commands, who had asked nothing and explained nothing and apologized for nothing, slowly, imperfectly, with great difficulty and occasional backsliding, learned 3 questions he had never asked in his life. Are you okay? Can I stay? What do you need? 3 questions that had no place in the vocabulary of the man he had been. 3 questions that became the vocabulary of the man he was choosing to become. He did not become soft. He became deliberate. He chose every single day to be present in her world, because her world was the first place in 17 years where he had felt like a person rather than a position. And Minjung, who had never asked for anyone's love, who had filled herself up so completely with giving that she had genuinely stopped expecting to receive, learned slowly that being cared for was not the same thing as being owned. That a man learning to kneel was not weakness. It was the bravest thing she had ever watched. So here is what I want to leave you with tonight. Kang Jiwoo spent 17 years building walls from a Tuesday evening when he was 17 years old and could not save his father. 17 years of cold, of distance, of armor so complete that his own men thought he might not be entirely human. And one woman, who never tried to change him, never asked anything of him, never needed a single thing he could offer, walked into his world and simply was herself. And that was enough to undo everything. So I'm asking you this. Is it possible that the most dangerous thing to a closed heart is not someone who fights it or challenges it or demands that it open, but simply someone who shows it quietly and consistently what warmth looks like, and then waits? Think about that, and tell me your answer in the comments. Tell me if you know someone like Minjung. Tell me if you have been someone like Jiwoo. I read every single one, and I mean that. If this story moved something in you, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear today that the coldest people sometimes carry the most fire. They just need the right person to stand close enough to feel it. And if you are not yet subscribed, I am asking you, right now, hit that button, turn on the bell, because every single week I bring you stories like this one. Stories that stay with you after the screen goes dark. Stories that make you feel things you forgot you could feel. I will see you in the next one.